Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching 30 Years' War Part 2, The Second Horseman by Extra History. And as we know, the Second Horseman, in this case, is war. Right, we found out last time that Extra History's framing device for this series was going to be the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. So last time we dealt with conquest, today is war, then we've got famine and death, all some pretty spooky stuff. We saw the build up to this 30 Years' War last time, also finding out just how destructive it was. The scale surprised even me, and so today we'll get to see how the rest of this war plays out. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and I'll give you access to a whole bunch of exclusive videos. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, "Come and see." And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given unto him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword. Magdeburg, holy.
Starting with our second Horseman War. Though I gotta say, I feel like conquest and war, at least in the context of this conflict, are pretty similar. So I'm not sure how themed this one will be. I'm sure famine and death can have more specific focuses, but even so, we'll get to see more of how the 30 Years' War plays out in this one, I'm sure.
Roman Empire, May 20th, 1631. A siege broken, a city burning. After months of grinding combat, Tilly's imperial army has smashed into the Protestant city. The Catholic League troops have set fires in the town, hoping that it will draw the city's garrisons away from the defensive walls.
Right, so this sort of starts out with the defenestration of Prague, an action which is seen as pretty hostile against the Catholics, sort of understandably. You have some of these Protestant little states and cities coming together, but then this imperial Catholic army takes aim, and they're really gonna, win this first phase of the conflict. Though, as we'll see throughout the war, it really goes back and forth, sometimes Catholics having the upper hand, sometimes Protestants. In this moment, the Protestants are struggling pretty badly.
But then the wind turned those 10 burning buildings into 100, and now flames, rather than soldiers, have stormed Magdeburg. Thousands of civilians huddle in basements to try to escape the horror, but instead they die there, suffocated or burned.
Jesus.
1,000 luckier souls gather in the cathedral, sure that the Catholic attackers will not burn it. But instead, in their relative safety, they're forced to watch as gangs of soldiers rob, torture, and murder the population. Only 200 of the city's 1,700 buildings survive,
Jesus.
as 20,000 men, women, and children die in a scene ripped straight from hell.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a reason I think they use the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse as their framing device, which is this war was described as many as apocalyptic. Now, I don't know if that framing device had been used before. Maybe it had, maybe it hadn't. It's a good framing device either way, but certainly many people at the time, especially, and even since then, have described this war in terms of apocalypse, because that's how hellish it was for the people, especially the civilians living in these communities.
Thanks so much to CuriosityStream for helping to tell today's historic tale. One reason Prague fell so quickly in 1619 is that their attempt to join an alliance with the Protestant states of Germany never really worked. Whether the empire's Protestants liked it or not, the Catholic Ferdinand II had won the election as King of Bohemia fairly. And
yeah, like I was saying, the first phase of the war is one that is not necessarily beneficial to the Protestants. Once again, that will change, but they have a hard time really marshaling their forces against this imperial force, right? We talked about this last time, how, of course, at this time, the Holy Roman Empire was really split between Protestants and Catholics, and obviously different kinds of Protestants as well. Lutheranism was one of these sort of official religions. We had Calvinists as well. It's all very complicated. So it was split, but the empire was essentially a Catholic empire, ruled by a Catholic Holy Roman Emperor, right, with the imperial army and the power of the Habsburgs. right? So that's a lot. If you're the Protestants, they've got really a lot of advantages on their side. The Catholics do. The Protestants, they were going to struggle, at least in the beginning.
Most German Lutherans were not in favor of backing an uprising and breaking their entire political system just to give the Calvinist Frederick V the crown.
Right.
Better to just wait and elect a new king after Ferdinand passed away. And if Ferdinand had been careful, it could have gone that way and stayed a local conflict. But then he started engaging in the most Habsburg of hobbies, empire building.
Mm.
Before becoming the rebel king of Bohemia, Frederick V had been, and still technically was, the Elector Prince of the Palatinate, able to vote for the position of Holy Roman Emperor. But since Frederick was now technically a rebel and a traitor, Ferdinand decided to occupy the Palatinate, to strip Frederick of his vote, and instead give it to his brother-in-law, Maximilian of Bavaria. Now, Ferdinand had many Lutherans on his side during the Bohemian Revolt, but this was a clear breach of the empire's rules.
Yeah, and so we see the conflict expand where, like they stated at the beginning, you had a lot of Protestants, a lot of Lutherans in particular, who, right when everything kicks off, they're not willing to risk it all, right? They say, even though we may have a religious interest in this, it would be too dangerous to start an all-out empire-wide conflict. We're going to stay out of it. We might even back the imperial side, or maybe we'll just stay sort of neutral, right? But as this conflict begins to expand, becomes clear there's some conquest in mind, gaining territory. It's more than just a localized religious conflict. That's when things start really heating up.
And when Catholic armies, including Spanish troops, marched into the Palatinate
Yeah.
with Maximilian at their head, things really kicked off, and other countries began getting involved. The Netherlands, which had recently revolted against Spain and won their independence, now saw that war resumed and get folded into the larger conflict.
Mm.
And the Dutch, at war with Habsburg Spain, suddenly warmed to the exiled Calvinist Frederick V and decided to bankroll his war against Ferdinand and Habsburg Austria.
Yeah, well, no longer is it, a religious conflict localized within one city or even one region or little state, but now it's becoming a war of conquest. It's becoming a geopolitical conflict, which means all the surrounding countries, they want to start getting involved because they see, first of all, risk, but also some opportunity.
Meanwhile, James I of Great Britain, whose daughter was married to Frederick, threatened Spanish shipping if his son-in-law's titles were not restored. And actually, Spain was, in fact, interested in negotiating.
And it's interesting to look at the geopolitical situation in this moment. All these countries that get involved. Britain will never be too much involved, in part because they're heading for their own conflict of massive scale. They're in the process of heading towards the English Civil War, which was, of course, very destructive and in some ways pretty revolutionary, right? So they'll have their own thing going on, while the continent really gets into killing each other at a mass scale.
Not wanting to spend itself on Ferdinand's behalf, and so the two worked out a compromise that would have prevented the war, giving back Frederick some of his land and passing the electoral vote to his son instead. But neither Frederick nor Ferdinand accepted the deal, and the war began in earnest. And look, I know that was a lot of information, but here's why we're getting into the weeds. This is how the conflict went from a constitutional crisis in the Holy Roman Empire to a black hole that sucked in soldiers from across Europe.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking this is all starting to sound a lot like 1914, with a local conflict drawing Europe into war, you most certainly aren't alone.
Well, I mean, that's a lot of conflicts throughout history, I will say. But sure, they start off smaller scale. There's essentially some spark that lights everything. And then, through a combination of other factors, whether it's the treaties of the First World War, or the period prior to the First World War, or it's the sort of geopolitics of this era, slowly other countries are brought into this conflict to the point that it escalates into a major continent-wide conflict.
In fact, soldiers in World War I thought the very same thing. But here's where politics really step in. Because while we throw around names like Spain, Austria, and Great Britain, in the 17th century, nationalism was still in its infancy. Religion, ideology, family bonds, or money often meant more than patriotic ties.
Yeah, and that's what we'll see throughout this conflict, which is, rather than talking about different nation states, you would be better off talking about individual aristocratic families different kings, rulers, families. I mean, those are the ones really making the big top level decisions here. And a lot of this conflict will be really kicked off in the first place by a very complex network of alliances and friendships and relations and rivalries that these families have throughout Europe. Right? I mean, we think in a very nation state centric way today. We think of each country as its own contained thing, right? And there's, of course, reasons for that. But during this time period, what you have is an aristocracy that's pretty international, right? Of course, each country has their own thing, but especially in a place like the Holy Roman Empire, even beyond that, what you have is an interconnected network of aristocrats who are the political decision makers who oftentimes know each other, right? And so, once again, that can lead to rivalries, conflicts, and alliances that can shape a conflict like this and do shape this conflict.
In fact, rather than thinking of countries, it's often more helpful to think about the leading families of each nation.
Yeah.
The Stuarts in Great Britain, the Bourbons in France, and of course, the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs. And another thing about the Habsburgs, they were not well liked. Controlling both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, they surrounded France, meaning
Yeah, I
that
mean, they were the most powerful aristocratic family in this moment, right? The greatest power of Europe at this moment, other than the Ottomans, I suppose, was the Habsburgs, right? I talked about last time how there was this rivalry to be the top Catholic power, and the rivalry was between France and the Habsburgs, right? Both in the case of Spain and their Austrian and German territories, right? Now, in the end, France is going to be the ascendant Catholic power. But at the moment, the Habsburgs, they really hold a lot of power in this geopolitical situation. And so they've made a lot of enemies gaining that power.
though the Bourbons were Catholic, they were also the Habsburgs' greatest enemies. Similarly, the Habsburgs' hardline Catholic policies set them against Protestant countries and even alienated parts of their own empire. Not to mention, they were also big into absolutist rule and the divine right of kings.
Well, yeah, I mean, this whole thing begins as sort of a civil conflict within the Holy Roman Empire. Now, look, I understand that the Holy Roman Empire was a pretty loose confederation, and so you had a bunch of independent countries within it, but sort of theoretically, this was part of that Habsburg domain, not controlled directly, but indirectly. So all this starts is, in some ways, a civil war between their own subjects, and then becomes this mass international war as everybody else gets involved.
To the point that Ferdinand's ultimate goal was to turn the Holy Roman Empire from a constitutional confederation of small states that elected a ruler who had limited power to one where he had direct control and could enforce religious uniformity.
Yeah, and so this is something that was obviously pretty worrying to the Protestant princes of the Holy Roman Empire. Right after Augsburg, they were left in this situation, which we talked about last time, where there was sort of vague religious toleration, where there was some degree of cooperation and understanding between these Lutheran states, polities, and these Catholic states. They could exist alongside each other, mostly without violence up until now. And after all the violence that had occurred immediately following the Reformation, well, this frightens all those Protestants because there's a chance they'll be forced into this unitary Catholic empire where they do not have the autonomy or the ability to run their own affairs and impose their own religious policy.
To put it simply, he wanted to make his territory a Catholic land. Even the Pope, who you'd expect to be down for this sort of program, felt queasy at the prospect. After all, he was also a prince of a small Italian kingdom, and he didn't exactly want a massively powerful absolutist state directly to his north.
Yeah, right. And of course, that's a conflict that had existed since the birth of the Holy Roman Empire, which is the conflict between the authority of the Church in the form of the Pope and the authority of the Empire in the form of the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, sometimes the Pope and the Emperor got along like chums, and they could really work things through together, but sometimes you had an emperor who was far more powerful, and he really dictated affairs, and sometimes you had a Pope who was far more powerful, and he decided how things would go, right? I mean, there's always this thing where you've got your religious leaders, your political leaders, and sometimes someone like the Pope could be both at once, both a political and religious leader. And so you've got this interplay here where it's like, okay, who do we listen to, the Pope or the Emperor, right? The Emperor is supposedly sort of infused with the authority of the Pope in a way, right? The Pope has granted him the crown, so should we listen to the Emperor, or is the Pope still the ultimate authority, right? In this moment, the Pope was not quite as powerful as popes of the past had been, right? But there's still that sort of tension there between the Pope and the Emperor.
So, over the course of the conflict, he'd gradually align himself more and more alongside France. Frederick, for his part, and with the financial support of the Dutch and British, managed to keep the Protestant cause alive in German lands, despite defeat after defeat from the Catholic League.
Yeah, so the Dutch and British involvement is in large part a monetary involvement. The French also get monetarily involved. Now, once again, the British eventually will end up with their own thing going on, so they'll be a little distracted. But even, sort of before that all kicks off, they've got a big involvement in terms of money, less in terms of manpower, right? There's a few countries who are more involved in that way. And then there are some countries, we'll see this later, who very much get militarily involved, even if they were not initially involved.
In 1625, Denmark intervened,
Yeah.
and its King Christian IV led 20,000 troops into Germany. But his success was short lived, and 4 years later, Denmark was knocked out of the war. And then came the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus.
Yeah, so Denmark gives it a shot. They don't really see too much success. And so Sweden says, hey, why don't we give it a try? Gustavus Adolphus comes in, maybe the best known figure of this conflict for his military exploits, and he finds a lot more success.
Entering the war with pamphlets and speeches, trumpeting himself as the savior of Protestant Europe. But the Germans didn't really think so. Partially because the German population was starting to get wise to the consequences of having so many armies marching and battling through their lands. Namely, that looting, sexual assault, theft, murder, and violence against civilians quickly became commonplace during the conflict.
Yeah, I think it was becoming pretty clear to anybody living in one of these territories that regardless of the ideology, what this war meant for you, as a peasant, a civilian, a farmer, all it meant was that armies were marching back and forth over your territory, probably requisitioning stuff, stealing from you, maybe burning down your property, abusing you, sometimes killing, raping family members, right? That's what this war meant for you, right? And so this new guy comes in and says, I'm the savior of all Protestants. You might be a little skeptical at this point. Though I will say Gustavus Adolphus had the military success to back it up, but at this point, for the civilians of these territories, this war had lost a lot of the meaning and was just pure hell and apocalypse.
The destruction of Magdeburg, which opened
And of course, the war's got many years to go after that point, right? So it's only going to get worse.
this episode being the most famous incident. Yet, that's not surprising, right? This was a religious war, and therefore you'd expect a level of sectarian violence and massacre. But that's not exactly true, because this violence was almost universally about money. See, the vast majority of the troops in this conflict were professional soldiers who signed up expecting to be paid. Expecting being the key word there. Because while all of these nations fielded armies, they quickly realized they couldn't reliably supply or pay them.
Yeah, and I think I said this last time, but oftentimes when something has sort of an ideological basis, you might want to dig a little bit deeper and try to find the material causes of these events. For example, oftentimes, and I'm more familiar with this in the case of England in the sort of 17th, 18th centuries, when you look at, say, for example, anti-Catholic riots, which happened a lot in England around this time, you'd think, okay, so obviously the reason for this is, the population, the mostly Protestant population, were mad at the Catholics, and so they got out in the streets, burned Catholic property, beat up Catholics, sometimes killed them, which is true, but also when you dig in a little bit to your sources, what you find is that disproportionately the people that were targeted were wealthy people, right? And this, so is there a religious aspect? Yes. There's also clearly a social and material aspect where you're targeting wealthy people, you're trying to make some money, right? And that's often the case for a lot of things. I was talking about riots in that example, wars, any type of conflicts. Dig a little deeper and you'll find there's usually money at play.
A problem that only worsened as the conflict stretched longer and longer. Even Spain, with access to American silver, couldn't keep up.
Hmm.
And in the absence of official pay, soldiers just started to, take stuff.
Right. I will say, even at this point, mid 1600s, Spain, they've already, I'd say, sort of passed their high point. They have at least stagnated, if not began their long decline. It hasn't gotten really bad for them yet, but they've already sort of ruined themselves through the mass amount of silver and gold they've brought in, inflation, lack of development in the country itself. So things are not going to be great for them in the future, and they're sort of getting to that point maybe around this time. I mean, they've had sort of a century of mass success, right? Of course, Columbus arrives in the Americas in 1492. The entirety of the 1500s, pretty good for the Spanish. As we reach the 1600s, things are starting to stagnate a little bit, and they will enter into full on decline. I mean, definitely by the sort of mid 1700s.
Granted, sometimes with a veneer of legitimacy, like Christian IV, who became famous for sending cities ransom notes demanding that they pay up or be sacked. Also, Catholic churches were a favorite target of his armies, with troops stripping gold and silver ornamentation before marching on.
Yeah, and once again, there's a pretty clear material aspect there where people want to make some money. But I'd also say look to the ideology, and that a lot of Protestants were pretty disgusted at how sort of lavish Catholic churches were and all the artifacts and ornaments and things like that. So, they didn't really have an issue stripping this stuff out and melting it down for gold. It fit with their belief system and also fit with them wanting to make more money.
In fact, Christian himself liked to confiscate reliquaries containing bones of saints, open them up, give the bones back to the church, and take the
Huh.
box. It also happened unofficially. Troops broke into besieged cities
Yeah.
and plundered them, stealing anything of value and torturing civilians to find where they'd hidden any wealth.
Yeah, and I mean, not that I'd. Well, if you're interested, you could maybe read some of the primary sources. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Pretty brutal stuff. You can read some sources from people with soldiers and civilians who lived through this, and they share some pretty horrific experiences of what they went through during this conflict, right? So, yeah, real horrible stuff.
Also, soldiers would raid villages and take livestock when their commanders couldn't come up with food.
Hmm.
And when a city that initially refused to surrender fell, it was well known that it would be looted for days. In fact, one man who survived the fall of Magdeburg as a child recalled 5 or 6 waves of soldiers coming into their house and demanding money. And when his family convinced a kind Catholic soldier to take them out of the city, he witnessed the fate of those who hadn't had anything to give the marauders.
Hmm.
Corpses lay naked in the street, with several women drowned headfirst in a beer barrel. And
Jesus.
when they finally arrived at the enemy camp, he remembers the soldier's wife scolding him for coming back with refugees rather than spoils of war. Granted, commanders did try to discourage this behavior. In fact, one of the most enduring pieces of art from the conflict, a series of etchings called The Miseries of War, famously shows a tree thick with the bodies of hung looters.
Hmm.
But this was not a humanitarian gesture on the part of generals. They were more concerned that looting caused breakdowns in discipline and made armies vulnerable as men broke out of their units and spread out to pillage.
Yeah, which it did. I mean, of course, the number one issue with this is the moral issue, in my opinion, but a lot of these guys were not so concerned with that. And it is true that all this looting really broke down discipline among the armies, right? What would have otherwise, or maybe what should have been, armies of professional soldiers, or at least trained soldiers marching through the countryside, became bands of looting marauders, marching through at their own pace, looting whatever they wanted, with very little cohesion to them, right? So, really not great for the army itself, at least if you're the commander of that army. And it meant that, we saw it last time, a lot of the violence was inflicted not on enemy soldiers, but on civilians during this conflict, which, along with the pure scale of death, which we saw last time, and it even surprised me with how many people died. Another thing that made this conflict exceptional, not in a good way, but exceptional, was the scale not just of death, but of civilian death, right? It was extremely, high percentage of the people who were killed.
But no matter how many men were hanged, It didn't change the fact that soldiers of all sides were frequently unpaid, undersupplied, and left to fend for themselves.
Yeah.
And all that looting, which took place over and over as multiple militaries marched through the lands, begot another problem. Because when the armies trudged away, carrying sacks of grain, chicken, and pigs, just as harvest season came and the first snowflakes began to fall, that was when the third horseman would arrive.
Yeah.
The deadliest so far. Famine. Hey everyone, IRL Matt and Zoe here.
Alright, I'll have their video linked down in the description below. You can go check it out, leave them a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. So this time we dealt with war, which really encapsulates all of the 30 Years' War. Next time we'll talk about famine, a more specific focus, but really one of, if not the most devastating parts of this conflict. And you know, of course, it wasn't just food being stolen and looted, it was the fact that, you know, if your fields have been marched through and destroyed, you know, you're not really going to have an easy time growing crops. So that was one of the things that made people suffer the most, were the famines throughout this conflict. But we'll cover that, I'm sure, in excruciating detail next time. If you guys enjoyed this one, you can leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Give you access to a bunch of exclusive reaction content. With that, hope you guys are having a fantastic day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.